Thank you so much, Rajinikanthji, and all of the organizers. It is certainly not fortunate that Dr. Rao is not well, or he has been an incredible guide, inspiration, leader for so many people all across this country for decades. We are deeply in prayer that his health does improve, and we are hopeful that it will improve. It's an honor to be able to be here, not in his place, because no one could fill his place, but we'll just say speaking at the time that he was going to be speaking. There's a wonderful story that I'd like to begin with of 3 men who are stranded in a boat in the middle of the ocean. And very much like young children do in their bedrooms or on their bed, the men have divided the boat into 3 separate portions, each of them feeling very content that, okay, I have my own part of the boat. And one day 2 of the men look over and they notice that a leak has sprung in the 3rd man's part of the boat. And they panic and they scream and they say, "Plug up your leak. The boat's going to fill with water, we'll sink, we'll drown." And the 3rd man says, "Oh, don't worry. It's only leaking in my part of the boat." And the reason that I love that story is we all understand that imaginary and invisible lines, or no imaginary and invisible lines, a leak in any part of the boat is going to make the whole thing sink. And yet, in our lives, we really do the same thing. We draw these lines between, we say, okay, this is my professional life, this is my social life, this is my physical health, this is my family life, and over here, this is my spiritual life. And we take really good care of our professional life, of our social life. Am I getting the promotions that I should get? Am I getting the projects that I should get? Am I getting all of the attention and acclaim that I should be getting? The proper respect, proper credit for the work that I'm doing? Socially, we pay a lot of attention. Am I getting invited to the right places? Are people speaking about me in the right way? Are they looking at me in the right way? Did I wear the right thing? We pay a lot of attention to our families, how our children are growing, our in-laws, our grandchildren for some of us, and even our physical lives. Taking vitamins, getting enough exercise, watching what we eat. And yet, with only 24 hours in a day, it becomes all too easy to let these leaks spring in that spiritual part of our boat. And it's not our fault. It's not that we sit there and we say, okay, I'm going to let that part sink. But when you've only got 24 hours in a day and we have to sleep this much and take a shower and eat this much and commute this much, we end up making choices. And one of the things that tragically ends up getting relegated to the wayside is the spiritual life. And we tend to think, well, it's okay, let the leak spring because everything else is strong. The problem is, like the boat, if a leak springs there, ultimately the whole ship's gonna sink. What I want to talk about today is this relationship between all of these, what we would call separate parts of our lives. But I don't even want to just limit it to the parts of the life in this body. Let us, for a moment at least, expand our understanding of my life and myself to include some of that which the rishis and the sages and the saints have been telling us for thousands of years, that we're one with all of creation, that we're one with the universe. So I'd like to speak for a while about all of this interconnectedness and how it works from a scientific perspective. Tragically, in the field of science today, people tend to think that the mystery of matter is somehow different and separate from the mystery of the mind, as though somehow that energy, that consciousness, all of the laws that make up the world outside of us are somehow different from the energy and the consciousness and the laws that make up the world inside of us. And that fallacy runs even deeper sometimes in a lot of the scientific traditions, where they say the body is an organ subject to all of your laws of biology and chemistry and physics. But the mind, well, the mind is something else, and the mind is inscrutable, and the mind is the domain of your churches and temples and synagogues, and we don't go there. And the problem with that is it's a horrible fallacy. And it limits our understanding and our ability to work both with the body and the mind. I hurt my back last month, and after I hurt it, I've never had back problems before. I was on a trek, it's a long story, but the point of it is, after hurting my back, only then did I realize all of the things that you do that have nothing to do with your back, that actually come from your back. So for example, in Rishikesh, the kitchen brings me a little thermos of tea in the morning. And to keep it warm, it's got this, top on the thermos that stays shut. And on the first day I realized, even though I hadn't hurt my arms or my wrists or my hands, I was absolutely unable to unscrew the top of that thermos. And for anybody who's ever hurt their back or who's a doctor, that seems obvious. But for those of us who had never hurt our back and whose field of study is not the physical body, I thought, well, that doesn't make any sense. My arms are fine, my wrists are fine. How is it that hurting my back has rendered me incapable of unscrewing a thermos of tea? And then you say that to a doctor and he laughs, because he knows, of course, that everything's connected, that of course everything you do stems from the back, even when we don't realize it. And what the field of psychoneuroimmunology has been talking about in recent years is the fact that the mind, and when I say the mind, I'm using it in a really broad, general way to refer to what we think, what we believe, what we now refer to as psychology, spirituality, faith, all of that your traditional modern Western science calls mind and therefore dismisses. Psychoneuroimmunology is teaching us, no, wait. Just like everything you do actually comes from the back, whether you realize it or not, in the same way, what goes on in this mind, this inscrutable mind, actually is directly connected to almost everything that goes on in the body. And even to that which goes on outside what we consider the body, what we'll call, just for the sake of the discussion, our extended self. And then we begin to realize the incredible potential and the power of, if we can get some level of our minds, our thoughts, our beliefs, our psychology, into our level of awareness and consciousness, and therefore control, how much in our physical world and in the world around us then becomes possible to change. I want to give you just a few examples so you know what I'm talking about. If I practice the piano, and I sit down and a piano teacher, I've never played the piano, and if a piano teacher teaches me a particular song on the piano, and I practice it every day for 2 weeks, the part of my brain that makes those fingers learn how to do this actually will change during the course of those 2 weeks. This is now considered traditional regular neurology. Nobody would argue with that. We now know that. We have brain scans that show that. Practice of this is going to change the part of my brain of the fingers. But here's what's interesting. If instead of practicing the piano, The piano teacher showed me how to do it, but she never actually let my fingers touch those keys. Instead of practicing the song she showed me, I only had to sit there for 2 hours a day and imagine myself practicing the piano. The fingers never moved. Those brain changes would still take place. And not only would the brain changes take place, but at the end of a 2-week study, if you take half the people and you allow them to actually practice the piece for 2 hours a day, and the other half the people, and they have to simply sit and imagine themselves practicing the piece for 2 hours a day, at the end of those 2 weeks, both groups will be able to play the piece comparably. And the brain changes will be comparable. So the question then becomes, well, if my fingers haven't actually practiced, but now when I have to play, my fingers have to play, what's been practicing? Where exactly does the mind, or in this case the imagination even, which is sort of a derogatory term in science, where does that end and my fingers begin? If practice is something in the hands, and all I've done is sit quietly and imagine myself doing it, what's happened? We look at pain. Now, pain is something that most doctors and scientists feel is a pretty physical phenomenon. We know how pain receptors work. We understand how the sensations travel from our body into the spinal cord, up into the brain, how they're perceived. We understand how to give medicine or injections that block pain receptors. So there's really a science of pain. Then you get amputees, people who have lost an entire limb. 50% of them experience what's called phantom pain. They continue to have pain in a limb that has been removed. Not 1% of those we can say are crazy or psychosomatic or whatever. About 50% of amputees have phantom pain. Where is that pain? What part of the body is sending a signal to the brain that says I'm in pain? If I take a pin and I poke my finger, a scientist can explain to me exactly the pathway from that finger to my spinal cord, to my brain, and how I'm going to understand the pain. But if I have no finger, where is that signal coming from? And then they've even gone a step further. What we know is we know that if a part of the brain no longer gets input, it doesn't just atrophy, but it actually gets taken over by other parts of the brain. It's very much like if any of you have children and you've had siblings who have shared a room, for example, and while both of them were in the room, the line was very clear. This is your half, this is my half. And they were very good, they didn't cross over. Then one of them goes to university or off to summer camp. And very, very quickly, the one who's left behind starts to occupy the other half of the room, such that by the time the one who's gone off to university comes home for Christmas vacation, they find there's no space left for me in my room. The brain does something similar. If it stops getting signals from a particular part of the body, so for example, if I've lost my left arm, so the brain no longer is getting signals from that left arm, that area that was previously used by the left arm will now get taken over for some other function. A lot of it typically gets taken over by facial functions, because our face is one of the parts of our body that we use most frequently. So they've done studies where they take people who have lost a limb and they tell them to close their eyes and they touch them on parts of the face. And they say to them, where are you feeling this pain? And they feel it in the limb. Because the facial sensation has taken over the part of the brain that was relegated for the limb, so they identify a touch on the cheek as touching an elbow that no longer exists. I share this with you just because I want to help blur those lines for you between physical and what we would call mental, but of course mental without the negative connotations. Or physical and objective versus what we would call psychological or subjective. If you get patient after patient, amputee after amputee, who with a Q-tip on their cheekbone says, I feel it in my elbow, we no longer can just say, well, yeah, when they amputated the arm, they must have, lost their senses along with it. Something else is going on there. With the immune system, we recently have learned that the neurotransmitters that are released by our brain, which we would call your emotional neurotransmitters, serotonin, norepinephrine, our immune system cells have receptors for these. Now, doctors and scientists know that if there's a receptor for something, it means there's communication. God's plan is perfect. God doesn't waste energy. He doesn't put things where they don't belong. So it's not like every single cell has receptors for everything. If there's a receptor for something on a cell, it means it is designed to communicate with whatever the chemical is that fits in that receptor. And if we have receptors for serotonin and norepinephrine on our natural killer cells that we had previously thought were completely separated from our emotions, what suddenly this tells us is, wait, they're actually communicating. We may not yet have a measure of how they're communicating. We may not yet be able to map the communication, but we can rest assured that God has not stuck those receptors on the immune system cells if they are not communicating with these emotional neurotransmitters, which explains why one of the phenomena in medicine is you've got 20 people sitting in a room, one guy with the flu sneezes, out of that room 2 people walk out with the flu, 4 or 5 walk out with, a little bit, they go home, they take some vitamin C, they recover, and a handful of people, it's like nothing happened. We know that. We know that if a guy with the flu sneezes in a room of 20 people, 20 are not going to walk out with the flu. So there's some variation going on here. And what we're starting to see is that a lot of that variation can actually be accounted for the modulation by our mind, our beliefs, our psychology, our thoughts. There's a term in neurology where they say neurons that fire together, wire together. And it's really common. Everybody knows about Pavlov and his dogs. So we have a situation where the dogs hear the bell ring. The neurons for hearing that bell fire at the same time that the dogs get this food. Naturally they salivate. So of course now the neurons for telling the mouth to salivate fire at the same time. So slowly over all of these weeks and months, these neurons that are firing together, hearing the bell and salivating, wire together, which was why Pavlov was able to show that simply ringing the bell, he was able to make these dogs salivate. But when we take it into human life and we take it into the fields of psychology and consciousness and spirituality, we have a situation, for example, where a young girl in her childhood, every time her mother shut off the light or her father shut off the light of her bedroom, they beat her. Or her brother with whom she shared the room beat her or raped her, whatever it was. As the brain became aware of the change from light to dark, that light switch got shut off. So did all of the neurons of anxiety and fear start to fire because she knew she was just about to get beaten or raped or whatever. So slowly, we've got darkness and fear. Now we have an adult who's afraid of the dark, which most of us would consider a psychological phenomenon, an emotional issue. We'd say, get over it, grow up. But what we now realize neurologically is that getting over it, any psychological or spiritual or emotional treatment of this woman is literally going to have to require a rewiring of her neural networks. Until and unless the darkness neurons get unwired from the fear neurons, you can tell this lady over and over again, you're safe, it's okay, it's okay, it's okay. But those neurons are going to keep firing. So any work with her is going to have to be aware of the fact that we've got neurons that are firing together because they've been wired, and therefore, how do we unwire them? So again, we've got these fuzzy lines now between hard science, neurons have wired together, and psychology that says, get over your fear of the dark. And of course, rewiring neurons is actually a lot easier than it sounds. I'll talk about that later. But the point is, for those of us in any kind of helping professions, we have to be aware of the fact that it's not always quite as easy as it sounds. For those of us whose neurons have not been wired for darkness and fear, it seems very simple. Get over it. Meditate. Pray. Have faith. But until I can create a change in the neuronal network, it's not going to work, and then she's going to feel like a failure. Lastly, there have been some studies over the last several years at some of America's best universities. Duke University did a study a few years ago. It was, well, they ended it a few years ago. It was a longitudinal study for 10 years where they studied a huge cross-section of America's population. And actually what they were looking for was lifestyle issues and how they related to longevity, mortality, death, and morbidity, illness. And they found many, many things in the study, but one thing they found was amazing. At the end of the study, having controlled for smoking, drinking, diet, exercise, everything that we identify as health factors, people who regularly attended a place of worship were 25% less likely to die of any cause during the course of the study than people who didn't. Now this is amazing. First they thought it was, well, because places of worship must tell people don't smoke, don't drink, get your exercise. So they controlled for all of that. Then they thought it must be the social networking factor. So then they controlled for all of that. People in tennis clubs and book clubs and social clubs didn't have the same benefit. And here's what's interesting. Simply being a member of a temple or a church or a gurdwara or a mosque didn't benefit you. You actually had to go. Paying your dues didn't give you any inoculation. You actually had to show up. But it made them 25% less likely to die of any cause in 10 years. Now, we still don't know why. Lots of different researchers have lots of different theories. Nothing has been proven. What we do know is that we're not handing out multivitamins as prasad. We're not running medical camps next to the temple. It's not that the food that we serve is somehow pure or more organic, or that the air is cleaner. So something else, something in the very presence of that faith that drives us to temple, that makes us not only pay our dues but actually show up, is actually inoculating us against illness and death. Along with this, Dartmouth did a study of heart attack patients. And when you entered their hospital after having a heart attack, on the intake form, in addition to all of the other questions that they asked, they added a question. And the question was, how religious are you? And there were 3 choices: very religious, somewhat religious, and not religious at all. after 6 months, those who had marked not religious at all, there was about an 11% rate of having had a second heart attack, which was fatal. Now, doctors and cardiologists know that that rate is pretty standard. In the 6 months after a first heart attack, approximately 10, 11, up to even to 15% of patients will have a second fatal heart attack. So that was standard. But those who marked very religious? Any guesses? 0. Not one. Again, they don't yet know how. They don't yet know why. But what we know is something is going on. That there's something about what we think, what we feel, how we think, how we feel, how our psychology operates, that's not only keeping us more grounded, more centered in our lives, but that is actually impacting our brains, our immune systems, the organs of our body. And what that does then is it opens up an incredible field of potential. I saw on a recent drive in this country, on a church sign. You know, outside of the churches, they have signs that sometimes say really beautiful things. And this one said, "Watch your thoughts and see your future." Watch your thoughts and see your future. And I thought about it, and I realized, yes, exactly. This is exactly what's going on. And this, of course, is what the rishis and the sages said to us thousands of years ago. But now science is showing it. We would never get into a car if it didn't have a steering wheel. Or if it had 10 steering wheels. Or if we couldn't make the steering wheel go. We'd understand very intuitively that if I can't turn this thing or steer this thing, I'm not going to get where I want to go. But with our minds really are the thing that have the potential to create our future, to take us where we're going. And yet, we spend so little time, so little energy on understanding that we're not able to go where we want to go in our lives. We've talked about the impact of our minds, our brains, on our own physical self. But now I want to just expand this a little bit into the extended self, the world around us. Many, many, many years ago, they started talking about studies that if you sang to your plants, they would grow faster. I'm sure we've all heard of those. And suddenly everybody started singing to their plants and singing to their trees. But what we now know is you don't actually have to sing to them. Yeah, singing works. But simply sitting there and loving them. Simply thinking love-filled, healing-filled, divine thoughts, silently, without even sticking a hand on these plants, actually makes them grow faster. And you don't have to be a miracle healer, you don't have to be one of those guys who can do all of these miracles. Ordinary, regular volunteers chosen at random will make plants and trees grow taller, grow faster, give more fruit, be less susceptible to all kinds of illnesses and diseases. They've even done an amazing study where they have something called a random number generator. And what a random number generator is it's very much like someone flipping a coin. If I flip a coin 100 times, I should get 50 heads and 50 tails. So that's what this random number generator does, is it does it automatically. And if you run it, it gives zeros and it gives ones. And if you run it enough times, you'll get 50% zeros and 50% ones. Unless you stick someone sitting next to it and you tell that person, as hard as you can, think 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. So we're not only now talking about operating on other living beings like plants and trees that we could say, well, they're connecting to us, we've united, and now we've got a machine. You sit somebody next to it, and you tell them, think as hard as you can, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. And they end up with about 55 to 60% zeros, or ones, whatever that person is thinking. Which, if you know statistics, is really statistically significant. If you can take a percentage from 50% up to